Good evening, everybody. Glad to see everybody here. In spite of the fact that you knew it was still going to be me tonight. Take that as a sign of your ability to endure. And so, you might go ahead and open up your Bibles to 2 Corinthians. We're going to be actually getting into 2 Corinthians tonight, eventually. And we're going to make that attempt to get into at least the first few verses of 2 Corinthians before we get started. Chris Lormore, would you mind saying a prayer for us here? Is there anything we need to be praying about as a family? I think we all have seen the news and notes. There's certainly a couple things in there we need to be thinking about. If you don't mind, then Chris, we'll go and get us started. Amen. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so we're going to try to finish up my introduction. For some reason, I thought with the extended time on Sunday, I would have not enough material, but you know how that goes. I had more than enough material. So we're going to try to knock out part 3 to start with. So the plan for tonight is to finish up part 3, and then we're going to get into the first few verses of 2 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to be very linear about this. So we're going to start with chapter 1 and move right on from there. All right, so that's the plan for tonight. First of all, I got some feedback that said if anybody asks a question, I have to repeat it. Darlene hasn't been feeling well, so she's been watching the live stream and was very clear that if you don't repeat the questions, you can't hear. So if you ask any questions or have any comments, I will try to repeat that. Somebody can give me the little symbol to make sure I do that if I forget, which I probably will. So we're going to try to do that as well. I was also told by Darlene I'm not allowed to wear pants with holes in it. So that's just the 2 pieces of advice that she gave me before I left tonight. So anyway, so we're all set. Okay, so part 3. So we've actually up to this point covered the timeline. I hope now you guys have a pretty good feel for the world as it existed in the first century, specifically when dealing with the city of Corinth. And so we have kind of zipped through there. We've talked a little bit about why Corinth was important. We talked a little bit about how Corinth became important, a little bit about its history. It was actually a very interesting history of a lot of different rulers and a lot of different things going on at that time. And so hopefully at least now you understand a little bit more about why Corinth was such an important city. So we're going to now kind of change gears and we're going to talk about the book itself. So we know when, we know about the city. So now let's just talk generally about what the book is about. And so we'll kind of try to dig into that before we actually start getting into the nuts and bolts of what the actual book says. So here's the stats. This would be on the back of the baseball card if you were looking at the baseball card for 2 Corinthians. And so the author was Paul and Timothy, right? So we're gonna see that there in just a second. We'll talk a little bit about that. The place of the writing was very specific. It's somewhere in Macedonia, right? So there was as I was kind of preparing for this, lots of people have very strong opinions about where they think this book was written. I don't have any strong opinions about where I think this book was written, other than it seems it was done in Macedonia. It was part of the third missionary journey, was when that was all going on. And so generally Paul was traveling when he wrote this. We know a little bit about the history as well. He had written them, obviously, a first letter, and which might have been the second letter, but from now on we're going to talk about the first and the second letter, just so nobody else gets confused, especially me. And so when he wrote the first letter, it was a very challenging letter for the city there. But then he also had made obviously some promises about trying to come back to Corinth, and he's going to talk about that in the first chapter. Right? He's going to go in and talk a little bit about why he hasn't come yet, but his intention of still coming, and we'll all get into that, into the nitty-gritty here in a second. When was it? It was maybe in the fall of 57. About that is what most people believe. We saw the timeline there. That would have been right in the middle of the missionary journey, the second or the third missionary journey. Probably he wrote the first book early in that year, while he wrote the second book late in that year. And so the fall or the winter might have been the time in which that would have been written to this city. Now the delivery, right? So, it wasn't like we have today when you just drop it into UPS or the U.S. mail if you really wanted to get there slow, or not at all. But you put it in and you send it, right? And so he had to have somebody send it, right? So he sent it with Titus. Titus was who would have been sent with that. And also, we're going to see he got some feedback from Titus as he was really trying to understand, the pulse of the congregation there in Corinth. And we'll talk about that here later as well, some of the feedback that he received. So just some things to keep in mind. This church at this point is only a couple years old, all right? This is not a long-term established congregation, right? I mean, it can probably be counted on one hand, maybe two if you have to. The number of years that this congregation has been around is probably two hands, right? But But it's been around a short period of time. And so this is still a very infant congregation full of relatively infant Christians. And so I think that's all interesting, at least for us to keep in mind. Is that me screaming? Okay, good. Because I've lost my phone and I don't know where it's at. So hopefully it's back there with you, Jason. So, and I was worried it was ringing. This is a relatively new congregation. And this letter was really sent, the second letter was sent really as a result of some feedback that Paul and Timothy had received from Titus. Titus had been in Corinth and had brought some feedback back to them. And so based on that feedback, he was writing them the second letter. So that's kind of a little bit of an idea of what's going on. Let me just make sure I'm up to my notes here. Let's see here. Delivery, okay. So if you actually look, we're going to read here in chapter 2 here shortly, a little bit about the reception of the previous letter, which we'll cover, Tom will probably cover for us. But obviously, Paul initially was in Macedonia and did not find Titus, who he was looking for. And so later, though, he met up with him and then got that feedback in chapter 7. We'll read about when he met up with Titus and got the feedback, which prompted this letter to be written. And so, all right. So that's a little bit about the book itself. So what is the purpose of this letter? I mean, this is all opinion now, right? And so you can read the book and determine what you think the purpose is. There's obviously some things we can glean from it. I think Titus' report that he gave him was generally encouraging. There were still problems, obviously, in Corinth. There were some problems that they were still facing, and Paul is going to refer to those. Obviously, there's still some issues with some Judaizing teachers, and it feels like maybe there was a lot of repentance had already occurred, but maybe there was still a little bit more to occur. But the news was generally encouraging from Titus, I think, and so he was, and for one thing, was going to respond to them and be very pleased with the results that he received from this letter. Now, I think as you're going to read through this with us, and we all read it together, I think you're going to find that Paul was extremely concerned about the reception of his first letter. And that's going to come out through a lot of 2 Corinthians. You're going to see him very concerned about that. Understandably, he was telling them some very difficult things, right? And when you tell people difficult things, even when you tell it to them in love, there's always a concern that how it will be received. And so that was one clear thing I think that was happening here. Like I said, there were some Judaizing teachers. But it seems as well, especially we're going to get this in chapter 1, seems like he was challenged about maybe his apostleship, maybe his credentials, right? And so for those who've had kids in debate, you always hear them arguing about the credentials of the debate or of the evidence they use, right? But he was clearly challenged about something about his credentials, at least at some point in the past. And so maybe a little bit about his veracity, his ability, and even about accepting support seems to have been issues of concern or at least contention for the people that were in Corinth. And so we'll kind of try to dig into each of those as we get into those. I think some people had obviously not fully repented yet, and we'll see that as well. But I think generally Paul's purpose was still to rebuke in some level, but also to encourage. I think you're going to find that. You're always told when you're dealing with people to do 3 or 4 positive statements before you do 1 negative statement, right? And sometimes that's really hard. But in this case, Paul, I think, is wanting to do a little bit of both, right? And so obviously that was part of this as well. This letter is very biographical almost. There's little doctrine in it, but we'll see what we can pull out of that. But generally, it's a response of Paul to a previous letter and some feedback that he received from Titus along the way. All right, so I'm gonna probably glaze through this pretty quickly, but this is just the outline that I pulled out, I believe, from Copeland. So if you've already got him printed out, this is just looking at his outline. Generally, we're going to start with the salutation, which is very Paulian. I wanted to say that, so I did. It's very Paulian, right? Paul. Then the first really part is it kind of explains this ministry, defends his integrity, he defends his apostleship, and he kind of makes an appeal to them. That's some of the early stuff. He then gets into this idea of collecting funds for for the church, for the saints. We see the Macedonian example. We see the basis of this in the message itself, and then we see this encouragement to give liberally. And we'll get into the nuts and bolts of that later as we get into those later chapters. Finally, Paul defends his authority. Talks about a little bit about his conduct. Does a little boasting, and then he has a final warning to him, and then finally the conclusion. So, in a nutshell, that's the book of 2 Corinthians. And so, we'll obviously look at a much deeper level at each one of these little sections as we kind of dig in there. And I hope I copied the right one. I had like 3 different versions of outlines for this book, and I know I used one of them. This is not mine, just so you know. In case anybody's wondering, almost everything you see up here is something I found somewhere. So don't think I've anyway been that bright. It's liberally stolen from other people. So just total disclosure. All right. Okay. So one last thing I want to talk about, and I think we talked about this on Sunday, but I put a slide in here for it, and I wasn't going to delete it because I already typed it out. But there's the mechanics of the class is really what this is from Tom. He wanted me to make sure you understood. Really, there's a goal to download the student guide. Just so you know, there's a student guide and there's a teacher guide there. You know, I'm putting you all on the honor system here. Go get the student guide and fill out your questions fairly, all right? But if you really want to get the teacher guide, it's out there too with all the answers in it. So I don't think we're going to be having a test, but who knows with Tom? We'll see. And so, there is a student guide out there, and if you want to answer the questions yourself, definitely download the student guide because the teacher guide's got all the answers in it. But do that. I think, Gene, did you just tell me they're all going? So I think they're all going out here. I think I'll ask Tom to be sure. And Tom, if you're online, wherever you are, please make some more copies. And so we'll try to put them out there as well. Okay. Please answer the questions from each chapter. That's going to be one of the things Tom really wants to spend some time on. He wants to go through, answer the questions. And I, at least for the first half of chapter 1 here, I've got the questions up here, and we're going to talk about them as a group if we have time in the next 20 minutes to do that. And so we'll be answering those questions in class each week. Everybody good with that? Nobody's got any concerns, problems, tomatoes? Okay. All right. So what is the purpose of the first letter? This is again my trying to prepare us to get into chapter 1. I think if you read the first letter to the Corinthians, you can see a lot of stuff happen, right? There's a lot of problems in Corinth. Obviously, there were just some irregularities with the way the church was handling things, with the way things were run, a lot of problems with individuals in the congregation. And so there was a lot of reproof in the first book, I think was very clearly can be seen. I would go on to say, and I hope I spelled that right. Is that severe or sever did I write? I never can keep those straight. But I meant severe. If that says sever, I meant severe. Because they're spelled differently, right? Jason's giving me a weird look. There was a severe reproof. I think this book was all about trying to say, guys, we're off track. Let's get on track, and let's make this work. Okay? And so I think he was very concerned about the reception of the letter. Understandably, when you're so direct, so clear, and many times so negative, like some of those things were in the book, clearly you're going to be concerned about that. These are people that Paul loved, right? These are members of the Christian family. These are people that he spent 18 months with, and understandably was very interested in their souls. Paul, coming from such a unique background, I think probably carried the weight of the brethren even maybe more strongly in his heart than maybe even other people might have because of his background, because of all the terrible things he used to do, right? And so I think he really carried that heavily, and he was very concerned about how that received. But I want you to notice, though, he still was very clear and very strong about what he told and what he needed to have this church do. And so then there was, of course, Titus's report, and this was basically the report on the first letter. But there was some discipline that had occurred, obviously. Some abuses had been corrected. And I think there was a general state of repentance that had occurred in Corinth. And so that was sort of what the first letter was about, and then a little bit about its reception. And so Understandably, Paul was worried about that, and so after writing that first letter, I knew he obviously wanted to go back to Corinth, and then he obviously wanted to write a second letter. And so really, he's refuting the slander in this letter and the vindication of his character. These are just some bullet points I took. He's interested in their welfare. He was grateful that the first letter was received so well. He wants to continue this reformation that was occurring in Corinth. He kind of wanted to talk again about his authority. He was collecting this money for Judea, and then he was assuring them that he was still going to visit them in the near future. It was all part of what this is in the second letter. All right, Mike.
Underlying thing that the Church of Corinth deals with in 1 Corinthians is the fact of they lack maturity. And that was one of the more fundamental underlying issues that you could see branched into how it manifested itself. And so I think that's probably important to keep in mind as we think about that.
Absolutely, and I do. When we get into chapter 1 here, I want to talk a little bit about that church there, and maybe what some of their not excuses, but for at least maybe a background about why they might have responded that way. But Mike said, for those who are listening online, Mike said that it was probably an underlying immaturity in the congregation there that was probably a big contributor to what was going on. Did I sum that up correctly? Good. Okay. All right. Chapter 1. After all that, we're finally going to study 2 Corinthians. Okay? All right. Let's do this general overview of chapter 1. I love overviews, can you tell? It's what I live for. Not really. But verses 1 through 12 here are really Paul, talking a little bit about Paul's sufferings and the trials that he faced, and a little bit about how God called him to endure those trials. And that's really what we want to try to cover tonight if we have time. We're going to try to finish these first 12 verses. The latter half of the book, 13 through 24, kind of addresses some accusations that were brought against him, a promise for him to visit the church there, and also talking a little bit about why he hasn't visited up to that point. And so that seems to be the mini outline of chapter 1. And so let's, without any further ado, get into chapter 1. Okay, and so somebody, I don't know how we're going to do this. Would somebody read the first two chapters of chapter 1? First two chapters of chapter 1? That was easy for me to say. The first two verses of chapter 1. Mike, please.
Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother, to the church of God which is at Corinth, with all the saints who are throughout Achaia. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ.
All right, so this is a very standard Paul greeting, right? I mean, he does this a lot. In most of his books, he has this little greeting that he kind of starts out with. There's some interesting things about this greeting, which I think we should at least understand as we kind of dig in. And so I said this is a very normal greeting for Paul. It's interesting he claims himself to be an apostle here. I think I checked, there's only 5 of his books that he doesn't claim that at the beginning. And so that's a very common claim for Paul that he makes. And notice here, though, when he talks about his apostleship, let me get over here to chapter 2, or chapter 1. Notice that he says, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God. And I think that's important. Paul, I think, wants to really drive it away from, this is not something I sought, this is not something I demanded, right? This is something that was the will of God that he was put into this situation. You know, if you remember, and this is just opinion, but I look back when he was first converted and remember that he was told in that time period the things he would have to suffer. And I wonder if some of these things were some of the things that were part of the suffering that he was going to have to endure by making those decisions that he made so many years ago. And so he claims his apostleship as of God's will and not of his own. Yeah, Mike? Yes.
And, the 12 we know about. Christ chose those. Christ also chose Paul, but at a later date.
Yep.
So it becomes a special apostleship directly from Jesus Christ.
Absolutely. And so Mike said that it was a very special apostleship that was later than the original apostles, but it was still directly from Christ that this apostleship was chosen. All right. And so he kind of claims his right as an apostle, and it was by the will of God. Now you'll also notice that it talked about there in verse 1, it was an all, so it's written to Corinth, obviously, so the city itself, but it was also written to all the saints throughout Achaia, right? And so we talked a little bit about Achaia Sunday, right? We talked a little bit about its history and what it really was all about. It's interesting, Achaia, I actually did just a tiny bit more research of it. Achaia was actually, that's it in red. And so if you notice, the Peloponnese is the big red blob down there. You can see they're just barely connected. That's where Corinth sit. And then that bottom part is the bottom part of Greece as we know it today. That was the Achaia senatorial district under Rome. All right? And so that term actually carried some very interesting things with it. Number one, any senatorial province was free of military involvement. So no legions, no soldiers were in those areas, right? Because if you remember a whole thing about when the armies came up to Rome and everybody was so concerned and the Senate was also up in arms. That was part of that rule that armies couldn't come into certain areas. And this was one of those areas because it was such a developed area. So it's free from military. It was probably one of the most prestigious of all the senatorial districts of the time. If if you were a diplomat in the United States, you think, what would be the prestigious places I'd want to go? Maybe France, or maybe, I don't know, where else would you want to go? Germany, or I don't know, maybe Australia if you like that kind of stuff. So those are the prestigious places to go, right? Nobody wants to go to Kazakhstan and outer Mongolia, right? Because you're always afraid there, right? And but this was one of those really prestigious gigs, right, that you could get. And so that was a big deal. It included Athens. You see right down here at the bottom of the Greece was where Athens sat. And so while Athens didn't have all its authority and its power that it used to back under the Greek times, it was still this great place of learning. And so it probably was only rivaled by Alexandria at the time as the smartest, most prestigious places for learning, right? And so that was also part of what was going on. And almost throughout the entire time the Roman Empire was in control, this area was at peace. And so that was another really nice perk, right? This area was relatively peaceful throughout that time. And very prosperous and urbanized. It would have been the nice area of the world to live. Now, as I kind of get us ready for this, I want you to let me tick off those little things I just described. Peaceful, prestigious, relatively free of military involvement, proud people, proud of their learning and of their urbanization and their power. What's that sound like to you? I don't know what's that. I think that's kind of like the little America of the time, right? That's what we are, right? We're the peaceful. When's the last time you really heard any kind of, 9/11, I guess, was the first time we had a real attack for years, right? It's relatively peaceful. We're very proud of our knowledge. We're very proud of our power. And so I can almost see some similarities between Corinth and the world we live in today. We are people want to come here. This is the area where it's the juicy spot for diplomats to come and live, right? And so I think this is, at least there's some correlation between what was going on in Corinth at the time and really what we live in today. And so keep that in your mind maybe as we step forward here, and maybe I'll make some points that go along with that. Okay, and so we'll see. All right. So, and also notice it talks about the saints. I thought that was interesting. Saint is actually a word that many times has been changed into being something specific as opposed to very general that I think it really is, which is nothing but the Christians, right? We are the saints. And so I think that clearly comes out here as you see the way Paul refers to them. And then finally, this was the administrative capital of Achaia. Okay, so that was the greeting. Anybody else have any comments they want to make about 1 and 2? Could you believe somebody could talk that long about 2 verses? Oh, Timothy, thank you. So Timothy was also was also one of the writers here, and Timothy, our brother. Let me see here. I thought I had some notes about Timothy. Have I lost them? Do I have one here? Oh, there we go. I'm sorry. Timothy was obviously one of the co-writers of this, right? And so when you really think about Timothy, I thought it was good to give him a little bit of a resume here. He was a child in the faith, was one of the ways he was described. He aided in the setting up of the Church of Corinth. He was involved in that process. And so he would have been well known, certainly in Corinth. He was with Paul in Ephesus. And he went to Corinth in the past to correct some problems that they were all facing. So Timothy would have also been a relatively known quantity to the church here, and would have carried probably some weight. I mean, he would have clearly, Timothy, you get the impression he was a guy that was godly, who was on top of things, and so clearly having Timothy as part of your co-writer, I think, carried some weight with this church as well. Thank you for reminding me. I just need to read my own notes, don't I? Okay. How are we doing for time? We got 5 to 10 minutes. Okay. All right. So let's kind of dig in here. Somebody go and read 3 through 7 for me, and we'll go ahead and try to close out with these verses. Chris, thank you.
Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ. Now if we are afflicted, it is for your consolation and salvation, which is effective for enduring the same sufferings which we also suffer. For if we are comforted, it is for your consolation and salvation. And our hope for you is steadfast, because we know that as you are partakers of the sufferings, so you also will partake of the consolation.
All right, so let's kind of draw the picture in our minds what's going on. Paul has just done the introduction, introduced himself in the greeting to the church here. Keep in mind, he had just sent them a very negative letter, and the first thing he starts to talk about is comfort. And that's probably not a coincidence, right? He digs right in and talks again to begin to talk about comfort. And I think we're going to learn some lessons about comfort here as well. Comfort is not necessarily something we just endure, even though it can be. When we need to be comforted, we endure things, then we can be comforted for those. But there's seemingly an underlying process that's going on during this comforting, which is going to be useful for this church. And so Paul definitely received comfort from God. God is definitely full of mercy and comfort. But why does Paul say he received comfort? What's the reason for him receiving comfort here? So to comfort others, right? And so Paul clearly sees this connection between receiving comfort and then being prepared to give comfort. And, you know, how many times have we heard that sometimes when somebody has endured something and then somebody else is faced with something similar, those people are really able to step in and give comfort, right? Sometimes they've experienced that they're not just sympathetic, but they are empathetic to maybe what has actually happened here. And so this church has obviously endured some stuff. It's had a lot of problems. It's had a lot of negative feedback given to it. And now it's seemingly coming around to some of those events and some of those things that were said about them. And so I think the comfort that it's now receiving from God and from others is now going to be something that will build in them and allow them to be comforted later. And so that's, I think, just an interesting point that I kind of dug out of here as we're really starting to go through this. So I kind of had a question here, how does this work? But I kind of just said what I think is how it works, right? So let me just throw this last question. What responsibility do we have then? If we receive comfort, what responsibility do we have? That's probably rhetorical, right? Almost. I would hope everybody would get that. Is that clearly if we are receiving comfort, that is building something in us that creates responsibility in us to be able to give comfort to others. And so hopefully the whatever you've experienced that you then gain comfort through later will be something that you will be very willing and wanting to share with those that you love and share with your fellow brothers. Yeah, Bruce, jump in.
receive. We're not talking about just giving a gift sometimes. It involves a lot of things that we can share with other people. Comfort, one of them, very important.
Absolutely. And Bruce said it's more blessed to give than receive. And as part of that is to, as we receive, that we are also going to give as well. And that's kind of the whole point I thought we could pull out of this as we're looking at this idea. Paul certainly kind of brings that out when he's talking about comfort and what's going on. And so then you see Paul obviously has experienced a lot of stuff in his life, right? He's been the tormentor, and now he's the tormented. We see that throughout his life. But you might recognize this list. It's from 2 Corinthians chapter 11. This is Paul's list of things that he kind of endured. And perils in the land and sea, he's endured the Jews, the heathen, he's been hungry, has had robbers, he's had cold, stripes or punishment. He's been imprisoned. All these things are part. Oh, and just then this anxiety for the church in general has always tormented Paul, right? And so these are part of the things that Paul has had trials and has had comfort. And I think the message that he heard back from Titus was one of comfort to him. The reception, the changes that had occurred in Corinth. And so I think he's now commenting on that and really pushing that back to everyone. Yeah.
Paul was before he got converted. And he had to learn a lot of lessons. He found out he was doing a lot of things wrong, and he had to change. And that first letter he sent to the Corinthians was telling a lot of things they needed to change and do wrong. I think that would have been accepted so much better by them, remembering that Paul was Jesus. He was the persecutor, and he underwent that change. So when he's telling them they're doing bad things, that's coming from somebody who's done worse things and make that change. And I think he would be very effective at being able to reach.
Absolutely. And so the comment here is that Paul had already gone through so much. He had been the tormentor, the tormentee. He had been all those things. He'd experienced all that stuff, and that made him maybe the people more receptive to what he had actually experienced and what he was going to say to them. That's a really good point. Okay. Oh, yes.
Yeah, real quick, Mike. This comfort that they received was supposed to comfort others in all areas. Is the implication. So, how do you do that if you haven't been through their trials? It's the fact that you can explain God is still there. He's still looking out for you, and He's still in control. And in the end, He will take care of you, and you will win with Him. And so it's not, you don't have to experience everything that they do, and you would understand the comfort that you receive from God.
Yeah, and so the point was that it makes it so much easier to understand when you are the one who has experienced it as well. The empathy is so much stronger there. Yeah. I'm trying to summarize. Yeah. Okay, good.
The thing is, you don't have to empathize. You don't have to have the same experience. What you do have to recognize is your comfort comes from God.
Okay, good point. And the point now, I'm going to try it again, is that you don't have to experience it when your comfort comes from God, that perfect source of comfort. Then that makes it able to be comforted. Okay, excellent. Okay, so let me just throw this last question out here, and then we'll probably be almost done. What does sharing trials and comfort do for us? When we think about ourselves as a body of Christians, a body of family, a group of people who love each other and are interested in the outcomes of all of us, how does sharing trials affect us, and how does sharing comfort affect us? Want to take a stab at that? There's probably many ways. Yeah. That would be a trial for me.
Camping out of Brown County every May, and we'd always have like a tornado out there. On the day we would have bad weather, we would go. Definitely did bond us all together.
So the comment is like when you maybe go camping together, the trials that you endure really bind you together.
together, it's a bonding.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think trials help with that. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, verse 5 talks about Christ's suffering. And in a sense, the Corinthians' suffering was because of Christ. They endured these trials because they were Christians. So it's connected to Christ, and also the comfort then is connected to Christ. So both of them are coming from Christ, or we share. We share in the trials, but we also share in the comfort.
And that's what the next few verses obviously are going to be all about. But that's a great point. Is that it's because of Christ, that because of what He's going through, that we share in those trials and those comforts. Yeah, Terry.
I was going to say that develops, I think, honesty and trust. Because now you've laid your life bare before them. That's going to have them trust you more, I think, in being able to share their concerns.
And that's a good point, is that trust can be generated from experiencing trials together and experiencing these events together. All right, so I'll leave you with the bad news. Tom is not going to be back on Sunday, so you got me one more time. And so we're going to be covering the rest of chapter 1. So we are going to finish chapter 1 no matter what on Sunday morning. All right? Thanks.
Well, good evening. It's time to begin our evening worship service. First song tonight is number 9, Our God He is Alive. There is beyond the azure blue a God concealed from human sight. He tinted skies with heavenly hue and framed the world with His great might. There is a God, He is alive, in Him we live and we survive. From the start there was a long time ago a God whose voice the prophets heard. He is the God that we should know, who speaks from His inspired word. There is a God, He is the Lord, in Him we live, and we survive from the start. Savior is life from mortal mind. God holds the germ within His hand. Though men research, they cannot find, for God alone does understand. There is a God, He is the Lord, and we live, and we survive from the start. Our God who sat upon a tree, alive must willing there to give, that He from sin might set man free, and evermore with Him could live. There is a God, He is alone, in Him we live, and we survive from the start.
In the second chapter of Malachi, God is rebuking the priest. The priest had a great responsibility as God's spokesman. And God's going to bring a curse upon them because they have not followed His ways. In the last verse of chapter 2, Malachi says through God, "You have wearied the Lord with your words. Yet you say, how have we wearied Him? In that you say, everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and His delight is in them. Or, where is the God of justice?" Then in chapter 3, beginning, "Behold, I'm going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. And he will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver. And he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to the Lord offerings in righteousness. There's some words in that passage I just read that are a little hard to understand maybe. But these profane scoffers have asked the question, the end of chapter 2, where is the God of justice? Where is the God of judgment? And so God said, I'm going to send my messenger who's going to clear the way. We know that that was John the Baptist. And I'm going to send the messenger of the covenant. We know that that is the Messiah who is coming. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And I believe this probably refers to the fact that in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 19, we as individuals in Christ's body are the temple of God. And then in chapter 3, he had mentioned the very fact that the church is the temple of God. So he will come to his temple, and those who seek him, they will find him in the temple of God. And so we are the temple, the church is the temple of God. And so, speaking of those who seek the Lord, he says, who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? This reminds me of Psalm 15, verse 1, when the psalmist says, O Lord, who may abide in thy tent? Who may dwell on thy holy hill? But who can endure the day of his coming when he appears, and who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and fuller's soap. I remember as a child, there was a Fuller's soap man that came around selling products. I wonder if that's where they got the name Fuller. And then he goes on to say, he will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver. These are words that I'd like to take a moment to concentrate on tonight. What does this mean? He will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver. Some ladies were studying this passage. They were bewildered as to what this might mean. And so one of the ladies said, without telling the other ladies, I know where there's a smelter, and I'm going to go talk to him and find out just exactly what this process is and what this might be talking about. And so I'll just report back my findings to the ladies the next time we meet. So long story short, she went to this silversmith, and concerning the smelter and his work, she tried to delve into everything that he did in this process. And after he had explained the process to her, she asked him, do you have to watch and stay with this and watch it real close? And he said, oh yes, a close watch, because if the temperature varies the slightest bit and it's too hot or too cold, then the process will be ruined, and the silver will not be of good quality. And so the lady at once saw the beauty and the comfort in this statement. He shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. Who is he? God is the refiner. He is the smelter. He is the purifier of his people who seek him. He is in his temple. His eye is steadily intent on the work of purifying, and his love and wisdom are both engaged in the best manner for you and I, those who belong to him. He will not let us be tested beyond what we can endure. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. Our Heavenly Father wants us to pass every test that comes our way. But one more question. The lady had one more question she wanted to ask the smelter. How do you know when the process is finished? He said, when I can see my image in the silver, the process is finished. When God sees his image in you and I, the process is finished. We can dwell in his tent and on his holy hill. Isn't that a beautiful scene? It brings tears to my eyes to even think about it. When God sees his image in you and I, he sits and purifies us. The test that we go through every day, he's pulling for us. He doesn't give us anything that we cannot endure. And so, what I have to say tonight is, the prophecy of Malachi has come. John the Baptist came, the Messiah has come. He has all authority in heaven and on earth. His body, the church, he is the head of. And so, in order for each of us to present offerings of righteousness, we must be refined, purified by our Maker. Verse 3. So the question is, are you being refined? Is God your smelter? Is he your silversmith? He can be. If you need to respond to Jesus tonight, it is through Jesus and his blood that we can be refined and purified. It's the only way. And so we ask you, if you have a need tonight, come to Jesus. Come to him as we stand and sing at this time.